A mafia boss walked in her restaurant, looked her up and down, and whispered something disgusting about her body in Russian, thinking no one at that table could understand him. He had no idea that the woman standing in front of him had been waiting for a moment exactly like this one for 7 years. And when she replied, in perfect Russian, he didn't get angry. He went completely, absolutely white. Marvella Sutton was a hard woman to ignore. She was tall, full-figured, and carried herself with a calm confidence that made everyone around her work harder without her saying a single word. She owned a restaurant called Ember and Salt in South Chicago, and she built it completely from scratch. It didn't start with a big kitchen or investors or connections. It started with a used food cart, freezing winters, and 16-hour days. Marvella saved every dollar she earned with the focus of someone who knew exactly what it felt like to have nothing. She never wasted money. She never wasted time. And she never wasted an ingredient. By the time she was 34, Ember and Salt was one of the most talked about restaurants in the city. There were no advertisements, no promotions, just food so good that every customer felt like it was their personal duty to tell someone else about. The wait list stretched 3 months long and stayed that way. Marvella ran her kitchen with precision and purpose. She cooked the way her grandmother had taught her, with full attention and deep respect for every dish. Her staff respected her. Her customers admired her, and nobody who ate at her tables ever left disappointed. But behind all of it, behind the reputation, the restaurant, and the quiet strength she showed the world every single day, Marvella was carrying a secret. She had been carrying it for 7 years. It wasn't a burden exactly. It was more like a letter, sealed and ready, just waiting for the right person to deliver it. She never went looking for that person. But on one Tuesday evening, he walked right through her front door and sat down at her table. And Marvella Sutton was ready. Nobody at Ember and Salt knew Marvella spoke Russian. She never brought it up at work, never used it around customers, never mentioned it in any conversation. It was something she kept completely to herself, a private gift from her grandmother Celestine, more personal than anything money could buy. Celestine grew up in Decatur, Tennessee, the kind of woman who quietly carried more than people around her ever realized. In 1987, she got an opportunity through a small Presbyterian missionary program to travel to Kazan, Russia, and work as a domestic helper for a family called the Drevins. She planned to be there for 6 months. She stayed for 14. The Drevin family was educated, warm, and genuinely kind to her. Oksana, the mother of the household, took Celestine under her wing in the kitchen. That is where Celestine learned Russian, not from books or lessons, but from standing beside Oksana every morning, listening carefully, repeating words slowly, learning the language the same way she learned to cook. Through patience, through repetition, through paying close attention to things other people overlook. By the time Celestine came back to Tennessee, she carried a Kazan accent that would have stunned anyone who heard it. But the language wasn't the only thing she brought home. She brought a recipe book, filled over those 14 months in her own handwriting, written entirely in Russian. On the surface, it looked like a simple collection of dishes. Soups, breads, preserved vegetables, winter meal. But tucked between those recipes were other things. Dates, names, conversations she had overheard, details she had memorized because something inside her knew they mattered, even before she fully understood why. She kept that book safe for the rest of her life. When Marvella was 4 years old, Celestine began teaching her Russian. She made it feel like a game at first. Words for colors, words for food, small phrases before bedtime. But as Marvella got older, the lessons became more serious, more deliberate. Celestine never explained the reason behind it. She just kept teaching, kept correcting, kept pushing until Marvella's Russian was as natural. Marvella asked her once why it mattered so much. Celestine just said, because someday it will. She didn't explain what that meant until it was almost too late to tell her. The Drevin family wasn't rich or powerful in any flashy way. They were simply good people living a decent life. Oleg taught literature at a university outside Kazan. Oksana kept the home running and cooked the kind of food that made you feel genuinely cared for. Their daughter Nadia was 17 and already serious about becoming a doctor. Their son Pavel was 12 and spent his free time collecting maps of places he hadn't visited. They were educated, calm, and kind. The type of family that minded their business and expected the same from the world around them. The world didn't return the favor. In February of 1988, On a Thursday evening, so cold the windows had frosted over by nightfall, a man named Gregor Volkov knocked on their door. He was 31 years old and already deep inside a criminal organization that had been quietly growing its reach across the region. He hadn't come to visit. He had come to collect on a debt that Oleg had borrowed to cover a family emergency, a debt that had been allowed to sit and grow through interest rates that no working man could ever realistically repay. Celestine was in the kitchen when she heard the knock. She heard Oleg's voice shift almost immediately. That specific change a person's voice makes when they realize the situation there. She stayed where she was and didn't make a sound. She listened to everything. Volkov's men moved through the house without asking permission. They took what had value and broke what didn't. Oleg tried to reason with them. That made things worse. By the time Volkov walked back out the front door, the family had nothing left and the outer structure of the property was burning, a deliberate message meant to be seen and understood by every neighbor on. The Dravin family came apart that night. Oksana was taken in by relatives in another city. Nadia and Pavel were separated in the chaos of it all. Oleg stayed behind, but something in him broke that evening and never came back together properly. Celestine ran. She slipped out through the back kitchen door into the frozen dark, holding that recipe book against her chest with both arms. She was shaking so badly she could barely keep her feet under her, but she didn't stop writing. As soon as she found somewhere safe to sit, she wrote down everything she had heard. Every name Volkov had spoken, every threat, the exact address, the date, the faces of the men with him. She pressed it all into the pages between recipe, in Russian, in small, careful letters, because she understood one thing clearly even in that moment of terror. The most dangerous thing you could do to a powerful man is remember him accurately. Celestine came back from Kazan a changed woman, not broken, but permanently altered in the way that people are when they witness something that cannot be unseen. She returned to Decatur, Tennessee, rebuilt her quiet life, and never spoke about Russia to anyone except Marvella. Marvella's mother left when Marvella was still young. Celestine handled that the way she handled most painful things. She acknowledged it once, directly, and then put her full energy into what needed to be. She raised Marvella herself. Every lesson she had ever learned, every skill she had built, every ounce of strength she had developed surviving things that should have destroyed her, she passed all of it to that girl. She taught Marvella to cook, but not just the mechanics of it. She taught her the thinking behind it, the patience behind it. She used to say that the kitchen was the one place where a woman could be completely in control of what happened next. Marvella grew up believing that, and it shaped everything she became. In the winter of 2015, Celestine was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. She didn't spend her remaining time dwelling on what was being taken from her. Instead, she called Marvella to her bedside and handed her the recipe book, the same one she had clutched running out of the Dravin house into the frozen night 27 years earlier. Then she told Marvella everything. The Mafia boss, the debt, the burning property, the family that was torn apart, the names and dates and details she had hidden between recipes written in Russian. Everything she had carried alone for nearly 3 decades. Marvella sat in that hospital room and listened for 6 hours without interrupting. She held herself together the entire time she was with her grandmother. She made it to the parking lot before she fell apart. She sat behind the steering wheel of her car for 45 minutes, crying in a way she hadn't since she was a child. The kind of crying that comes from grief and rage arriving at the exact same moment. When she finally drove home, something had shifted in her. She wasn't broken by what she'd heard. She was clarified by it. 11 days later, Celestine passed away holding Marvella's hand. Her last words were in Russian, soft, barely audible, but clear. Wait for the right moment. Marvella promised her she would. She kept that promise for 7 years. Marvella didn't fall apart after Celestine died. She gave herself a short time to grieve, and then she got to work. She started with the recipe book. She went through every single page, translating carefully, cross-checking her grandmother's Russian against her own to make sure nothing was missed or misread. Celestine had been thorough. The details she had hidden between those recipes were precise. Names, dates, locations, exact words spoken. It wasn't the writing of a frightened woman trying to forget. It was the writing of a woman who fully intended for it to be used one day. When Marvella finished translating, she tracked down a man named Corbin Way. Corbin was 63, retired, and living a quiet life in Evanston, Illinois. He had spent 30 years as a federal investigator working organized crime cases across multiple countries. He knew Celestine through a connection from her missionary days, someone who had helped him years ago in a way he never forgot and never fully repaid. When Marvella called him and told him who she was, he agreed to meet her without asking many questions. They sat across from each other at a diner on a gray February morning. Marvella slid the translated book across the table. Corbin picked it up and read without saying a word for 20 minutes. When he set it down, he looked at her and said that her grandmother was the bravest woman he had never properly thanked. Then he told her he was in. What followed was 6 years of quiet, careful work. Corbin knew how to build cases that held. He tracked down witnesses, people connected to the Dravin family, people who had been present on the edges of Volkov's operations, men and women who had spent decades scattered across Europe, staying silent out of fear. Some of them were ready to talk. Not publicly, not yet, but on record, to someone they trusted. The file grew steadily. Documents, photographs, timelines, corroborating accounts that matched what Celestine had written down decades. Marvella kept the file locked in a fireproof safe inside her office at Ember and Salt, behind a shelf of her grandmother's cookbook. Nobody on her staff knew it existed. She never rushed it. She never talked about it. She just cooked, ran her restaurant, and waited for the moment Celestine had told her to wait. She was her grandmother's granddaughter in every possible way. The reservation came on a Thursday evening, 6 days before everything changed. Deschamps took the call and came to find Marvella in the kitchen. He told her a third-party contact had booked the private dining room for 8 people. Cash deposit already paid. The name on the reservation was listed simply as the Volkov party. He said something about it felt wrong to him. The way it was booked, the way the contact spoke, the fact that nobody had asked a single question about the man. Deschamps had good instincts, and he trusted them. Marvella listened to everything he said, then told him to prep the bone marrow and trust her. He didn't push back. He knew her well enough not to. What Deschamps had no way of knowing was that Marvella had been watching Gregor Volkov for 2 years. Through Corbin's network, she had been tracking the Mafia boss's movements as his operation quietly extended its reach into Chicago. Volkov had a specific pattern when he moved into a new city. He didn't show up with threats right away. He dined first. He would identify restaurants that were doing well independently, places with strong reputations and no corporate backing, and he would send people in to eat, to observe, to assess. If he liked what he saw, a more serious kind of interest would follow, the kind that was difficult to refuse. Marvella had understood this pattern for a long time, and she had, very deliberately, made sure that Ember and Salt was visible enough to eventually catch the attention of it. She had placed the restaurant exactly where Volkov would find it when the time was right. She just hadn't expected it to happen this fast. When Deschamps told her the name on the reservation, she went still. She was standing at her personal prep station, and without thinking about it, her hand moved to the edge of her grandmother's recipe book, which sat on the small shelf just above the counter where she always kept it. She stood like that for a moment, not panicking, not rushing, just letting the weight of the moment settle over her. 6 years of careful work. 6 years of building a file, gathering witnesses, staying patient, keeping her mouth shut and her head down. 7 years total, if you counted from a night Celestine told her everything in that hospital. She had promised her grandmother she would wait for the right moment. She took a slow breath, straightened her chef's coat, and said quietly to no one in the kitchen except maybe Celestine herself, "All right, Grandma. Here we go." Gregor Volkov arrived at 7:15 with 7 men and the kind of energy that fills a room before anyone speaks. He was broad, silver-haired, and moved like someone who had never once in his adult life been made to feel uncomfortable. His people settled into the private dining room the way men like that always do, taking up space, speaking at a volume that assumes everyone around them is irrelevant. His bodyguard Theo Barrick didn't sit. He positioned himself near the door and stayed there, quiet and watchful, scanning the room the way people do when their entire job is to notice things before they become problems. At 7:30, Marvella walked in. She came out personally for every private booking. That was her standard. She introduced herself, walked the table through the evening's menu, and explained each course with the kind of calm confidence that comes from genuinely knowing your craft at a deep level. She wasn't performing. She was simply someone who knew exactly what she was doing and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. She was mid-sentence, describing the second course, when Volkov leaned slightly toward the associate sitting beside him and said something in Russian. He didn't lower his voice much. He didn't feel the need to. What he said, with a smirk he didn't bother hiding, was that they had sent a cow to explain the food. Two men at the table who understood Russian smiled. The associate beside Volkov laughed quietly. Volkov settled back in his chair, looking satisfied with himself in the small, lazy way that men do when they've said something cruel and faced zero consequence. Marvella didn't pause. She finished her sentence in English. She set the menu card down on the table. She turned toward the door. Then she stopped. She turned back around. She looked directly at Gregor Volkov. Deschamps was standing in the doorway behind her, and later he would say that the expression on her face was the calmest he had ever seen on another human being in his entire life. Not cold, not angry, just completely, utterly settled. And then she spoke to him in Russian, flawless Russian, Kazan dialect, the same dialect Celestine had spent years making sure Marvella could speak without thinking about it. She told him that the main course he was about to be served came from a family recipe. A recipe passed down from a grandmother who had once worked in a household outside Kazan, on Ulitsa Beregovaya, behind the Iron Gate, the third house on the left. Gregor Volkov's hands stopped moving. Theo Berek took one slow step away from the door and then went completely still. Nobody at that table made a sound. Not the kind of silence that comes from politeness. The kind that comes from something landing that cannot be taken back. Marvella set the menu card down gently, straightened her chef's coat, and walked back to her kitchen without looking back once. The food went out on schedule. Every course plated exactly as it should be, each dish arriving at the right temperature, presented with the same care ember and salt put into every table regardless of who was sitting at it. The dining room smelled extraordinary. Under any normal circumstances, no one would have been able to resist it. Nobody touched a thing. Deschamps moved in and out of the room with his staff, keeping everything professional, but his jaw was tight. Each time he entered, he let his eyes move carefully across the table, reading the room the way he had learned to do growing up, quickly and without making it obvious. He had caught enough of what Marvella said at the table to know that something serious had just happened. He didn't know the full shape of it yet. He knew better than to ask her while service was still running. Volkov sat at the head of the table and said nothing. One of his associates tried to start a quiet conversation twice. Something about logistics, something about a scheduled meeting later in the week. Both times Volkov shut it down with a single look. No words, just a look that made the man stop mid-sentence and not try again. Volkov stared at his food. Not the way a person stares at something they're deciding whether to eat. The way a person stares at something when their mind is somewhere else entirely and their body just hasn't caught up yet. His expression sat in the space between fear and calculation, not fully either one, but carrying weight from both. Theo Berek stayed near the door the entire time. He had worked for Gregor Volkov for 14 years. In that time, he had watched the Mafia boss sit across from dangerous men, handle threats, navigate situations that would have unraveled most people. Volkov had always been the steadiest person in the room. That was the whole point of him. That was why people feared him. Theo had never seen him look like this. At the 43-minute mark, Volkov spoke for the first time since Marvella had left the room. He said 2 quiet words to his associate. Have the cars brought around. That was it. 8 men stood up from a table covered in untouched food and walked out of ember and salt without a word to any member of staff. No complaint, no confrontation, no explanation. They moved through the restaurant and out the front door and got into their vehicles and drove away into the Chicago night like they were leaving a place they needed to put distance between themselves and as quickly as possible. Deschamps went into the private dining room to begin clearing and stood there for a moment before he started. 8 full plates. Not a fork moved, not a glass touched. He said later that the room felt different, like the air itself had shifted into something heavier while those men were sitting in it. The black car was there when Deschamps arrived to open up the next morning. Parked directly outside, engine off, just sitting there. A man in a charcoal coat got out when Deschamps unlocked the front door and handed him a sealed envelope without saying anything beyond Marvella's name. Then he got back in the car and waited. Deschamps called her immediately. She arrived 20 minutes later, took the envelope from him, walked straight into her office, and closed the door behind her. Inside was a single ivory card. Volkov had written on it himself, 4 words in Russian and a phone number beneath. The handwriting was careful, almost formal, which said more about his state of mind than else. Men like Volkov don't write carefully unless something has genuinely unsettled them. Marvella read it twice. Then she set it down on the desk and rested her hand on her grandmother's recipe book for a moment. Not dramatically, just the way you reach for something familiar when you need to steady yourself. Then she picked up her phone. She called Corbin first. She told him Volkov had made contact and read him what the card said. Corbin went quiet for a few seconds. Then he said that a scare man only does one of two things. He runs or he tries to buy silence. He said it didn't matter which one Volkov was attempting because either way they were ready and it was time to move. Marvella said she agreed. She hung up and made the second call. This one went to a woman named Adrian Okafor. Adrian was a federal prosecutor who worked organized crime cases and had been connected to Corbin for years. She was the person the file had always been intended for, the right hands at the right level, with the authority to actually do something with what Celestine had started building in a kitchen in Kazan 30 years. Adrian had known the file existed. She had been patient about it because Corbin had told her it needed to be airtight before it moved. Marvella told her it was time. Adrian said she would send someone to collect everything that afternoon. Marvella said the file was already organized and her grandmother had made sure of that from the very beginning. She ended the call, sat still for just a moment long. Then she put her phone in her pocket, stood up, straightened her chef's coat, and walked back out into the kitchen. Deshawn was standing there watching her with an expression full of questions he didn't know how to start asking. She handed him a cutting board. "Shallots first," she said. He took the board. He didn't ask anything. He just got to work. For months after that Tuesday evening, Gregor Volkov's world began to fall apart. It didn't happen with sirens or headlines. It happened the way a structure collapses when everything holding it up has already been removed, quietly at first, then all at once, and with no way to stop it. Federal proceedings moved forward through channels that led nowhere near a restaurant on the south side of Chicago. Witnesses who had spent 30 years staying silent finally spoke, protected and prepared by people who had spent years making sure their accounts would hold. Documents that had been buried surfaced in the right hand. Associates who had stood beside Volkov for decades began creating distance between themselves and him with the urgency of men who understood that staying close to something sinking is its own form of going under. Corbin Waite followed the proceedings from a distance. He had spent his entire career watching powerful people avoid consequences, and he had never fully stopped believing that justice is possible, just slow. On the morning the first indictment was announced, he sent Marvella a single text message. No words, just a candle emoji. She looked at it for a long moment, and then set her phone face down on the counter and went back to work. Her name never appeared anywhere connected to the case. No testimony, no public record. No trail leading back to Ember and Salt, or to a woman who had quietly spent 6 years making sure everything was in place before she made a single move. She had learned that from Celestine too. Do the work. Stay out of the noise. She promoted Deshawn to head of operations. She hired 2 new sous chefs, a young woman named Britta Calloway from Memphis who had serious talent and zero patience for shortcuts, and a young man named Ezra Fontaine from New Orleans who barely spoke, but cooked like he had something to prove. Marvella trained them both the way Celestine had trained her, with patience, with high standards, with the belief that every dish carries something of the person who made it, whether they intend it to or not. On the 1-year anniversary of that Tuesday, she added 1 new dish to the tasting menu. It came from a last page of Celestine's recipe book, written the same night her grandmother ran out of a burning property in Kazan into the frozen dark, holding that book against her chest like it was the most important thing, because it was. Marvella named the dish Olitsa, Russian for the street. The menu described it simply as a family recipe, passed down with love and patience, best served when the moment is finally right. On the first night, she served it. Deshawn watched her plate it and asked what the name meant. She told him her grandmother had written it for someone who hurt her family and never got to serve it herself. Deshawn looked at the dish and asked quietly if she thought Celestine knew. Marvella set the plate down and smiled. She always knew, she said. That's why she wrote it down.